The iconic picture of the American Army during the American Revolution is that picture of Valley Forge that shows men traipsing barefoot through the snow, and nowhere in the whole scene is there any female figure. This picture, I won't say is a lie, but it's inaccurate. In fact, anywhere the Army encamped, whether it was Washington's main army or militia divisions that had been called up, wherever there was an Army encampment, there were scores of women. Women came into the camps for a variety of reasons. They were called camp followers, and normally people think that means a prostitute. But in fact, camp followers were the wives, daughters, sweethearts, fiancés of the men who were in the Army. They came in part because of necessity. The war, which was a home front war, was extremely difficult on the civilian population. There was a shortage of food, there was a shortage of essential supplies. If anyone has seen that show 1776, if you remember, Abigail Adams sings, "Pins, John, pins, that's what I need." Well, most of the things that women needed for vital household production, including pins, came from England, and when war began, those supplies were cut off. Salt was extremely difficult to get hold of, for instance, and you needed it to preserve meat for the winter because there was no refrigeration. So that women were in danger of not being able to feed their families over the winter. And the wives of enlisted men wrote to their husbands, "I have no food, your children will starve. We have no firewood, your children will freeze." And this is the major reason why men deserted the Army, because they wanted to go home and take care of their families. Women also were in danger from the enemy army. When the enemy came through their town or their village or their city, they took from the family all the supplies that were available. So they emptied the larder, they emptied the fields, that is, they took the crops, and in some cases they took the furniture out of the house to burn in their camps to keep them warm. So women were desperate as winter came. It's also true that armies raped, and so women were fearful for their lives. They were fearful that their children would not survive, and so they picked themselves up and they went to the Army camps. So that picture of Valley Forge, if it were to be accurate, would be a picture of an instant city. Men, women, children, dogs, favorite goats, household supplies. Women arrived in these Army camps, and they turned into urban centers. Washington was never happy about this. He thought it interfered with the professional army, but he never sent these women home. One reason he never sent the women and the children home was he knew that their husbands would follow them. Desertions went down when women were present. When a man was certain that his wife was safe, his children were safe, he was not likely to abandon the Continental Army. Secondly, women did absolutely vital chores for the Army. They were the unofficial quartermaster corps of the Army. They did sewing, they did laundry, they gathered the wood for fires, they cooked the food, they nursed the men when they were sick. And some of what they did was absolutely essential to keep the men battle ready. One of my favorite stories always is the story of lice, that the boys who joined the Army, and they were young boys, 15, 16, 17 years old, apprentices or farm boys who came into the Army in the clothes that were on their backs. And like teenage boys probably everywhere, they didn't think about washing their clothes. And so they lived for weeks in their clothes. And they got lice. And I guess like boys everywhere, when they got lice and they itched, they scratched. And they scratched so much that they had scabs all over their bodies. They still didn't wash their clothes. And they were bored sitting around doing nothing, because a lot of warfare is sitting around and doing nothing, especially in the winter, because armies normally didn't fight in the 18th century in the winter. And so the boys made up a game, and one of the games they made up was throwing hot tar at the lice all over their body and then counting up who had killed the most lice. So now they had scabs and they had burns all over their bodies. And the men who were responsible for reporting whether the soldiers were battle ready would often have to say, well, I have 5 young men who were so scarred and so scabby and that they are not battle ready. Well, Washington and commanders everywhere realized that what they needed was women to do the laundry. And if the army was on the move and they didn't have wives and daughters, every town they went through, they hired women to be laundresses. This was one of the most important things that the army could do, is to find women who would do laundry for both the officers and for the men. So Washington made very good use of the women who came into the army camps. Still, if you read his order books, you can see how frustrating it was for him. At one point, he's trying to move the army quickly, and he records, I was trying to move, but we had 8 women who were giving birth, and so we had to stay until the children were born. So for him, it was a logistical nightmare, but it was also a benefit to the army. Now, most of the women who came into the army camps were their wives and sweethearts and daughters of ordinary farm men or urban workers, and they were poor. They got half rations compared to the men, and so they were themselves often a little ragged by the time the winter was over. And observers, women who wrote in their diaries as the army marched through their towns, often described these women as harrigans, as wild-looking, dirty women whose hair was uncoiffed, which it certainly was, whose clothes were in tatters, who looked dirty and exhausted. And that's exactly what these women were, because they were working quite hard all winter long with very little sustenance and very little comfort. They slept in the tents with the men. So camp followers are a very important set of participants in the American Revolution. That picture of Valley Forge as an all-male encampment denies and silences the reality that women are a crucial part of the American army. In the forts, camp followers often became combatants. Most people have heard of a person called Molly Pitcher, and they think Molly Pitcher is an actual person. There's no such person as Molly Pitcher. She is to the American Revolution what Rosie the Riveter was to World War II. There was no person named Rosie the Riveter. That was the name they gave to every woman who worked in the factories that built the machinery that made it possible for the American Army and Navy and Marine Corps to fight. Molly was a very common nickname in the 18th century, and they were called Molly Pitchers because the cannons in the forts had to be loaded by hand, and when they were fired, they became very hot. And so they had to be cooled down with water. And so the men would fire the cannon, and then they would shout, "Molly Pitcher!" And a woman would come running out of the barracks into the open space where British cannonballs and Indian arrows were coming over the fortress wall, and they would come to water down the cannons. Sometimes, if the man operating the cannon or his assistant fell wounded or dead, the women would take up that position and they would fire the cannons. And that's where we get the other iconic picture, which is of a woman in petticoats with her hair pinned back loading the cannon. But there were literally hundreds of these women. Many of them were wounded in these battles. And researchers have found almost 250 requests for pensions as wounded veterans that went into the Continental Congress and then the Confederation Congress from women. Almost none of them received any reimbursement or any compensation for their battle wounds. We know of one, for instance, from New York State named Hannah Corbin. She was wounded while she was operating a cannon. She lost the use of her left arm. She was carried off with other wounded people in a wagon. It must have been excruciatingly painful. And she did sue, and she got a veteran's pension. But most of the women who participated did not and have disappeared, sadly, from our history books where they have a rightful place to be. Some of the camp followers were officers' wives, and these are the women people have often heard about. That is, we know that Martha Washington joined her husband every winter wherever the army was encamped. Martha didn't want to go. She was a homebody and she wanted to stay at home in Virginia, but she felt it was her obligation to her husband and to the army, and so she went every winter. Now, when the generals' wives, like Martha Washington or Katie Green or Henry Knox's wife, Lucy Knox, went to the encampments, they did not sleep in tents. Their husbands commandeered homes for them nearby and sent enlisted men to work as domestic servants for these women, so that the household was filled with soldiers who were cooking and or cleaning or serving the food at the dinner table, because the job of these women, in a sense, I use job in quotes, was to entertain the officer corps, to keep their morale up. And so there were often dinner parties, there were dances or balls, as they called them, given. And it's quite comic to see the invitations to the balls, only to officers. Enlisted men were not invited, but the invitation said, you must have respectable breeches on, respectable pants that don't have holes in them anywhere, because the officers, like the men, often were in clothes that were shop worn, that is, were old and had seen several years in the army. And so there were rules about what you weren't allowed to come if you were going to show skin under your pants. These women came not because they were fearful or desperate or lacked food or firewood. They came in part because they thought it was their duty, and they came because they really believed it was important to show that the officers' wives, as well as the enlisted men's wives, were willing to make the sacrifice to come to the army camp. And so in that sense, it was a patriotic gesture on their part. But some of them reveal in their letters that they came because they were lonely. Lucy Knox, Henry Knox's wife, is a great example of this. She was an only child, and her parents, the Fluckers, were loyalists, and they had left America and gone to England. And she would write to Henry Knox, who she called Harry, "My dear Harry, I am so alone. I come home to an empty house at night, and I miss you so much, and I have no one to talk to." And so she raced as soon as the army sat itself down. Lucy Knox was in the army camp. And there she socialized with other women of her social class, and she saw her husband, and she loved it so much that it was very hard for Henry Knox to get her to leave. And you would see an exchange of notes where he would say, we're about to go to battle, dear. You've got to go home. And she would say, oh, just one more day, just one more week. I don't want to go home. I love it here. The other wife that I enjoyed always was Katie Green, Catherine Green. Catherine Green was Nathaniel Green's wife, and Nathaniel Green was a Quaker who decided it was important, despite his religious faith, to defend his country's liberty. He was not a wealthy man. Katie Green was much younger than him. She was really close to being a teenager, and he adored her, and he indulged her tremendously. And Katie Green, if you live in New York, we have a department store called Bloomingdale's where all the young, fashionable women used to shop. And I always refer to Katie Green as the first Bloomingdale's lady, because before she came to camp, she would insist on going to Providence and buying a whole new wardrobe. And this was very expensive for Nathaniel Green. And he would write her a letter saying, well, Katie, maybe you could wear some of the dresses that you brought to camp last year. And she would write back, I couldn't possibly be seen in the same clothes I had on last year. I have to go buy a completely new wardrobe. And you can just see Nathaniel Green sighing and going, okay, dear, go ahead. She was very charming, very pretty, a little, at the time, sort of giddy, and a great dancer. And Martha Washington didn't like to dance. Washington loved to dance. He was a very fine dancer. And in the 18th century, it was men's well-turned ankles and calves, not women's, that were a sign of attractiveness, because men wore shorter pants and stockings. And Washington liked to show off his well-turned ankle and calf, and he loved to dance, because that was one place where you could really show it off. And so he would dance at these balls all night with Katie Green and have a wonderful. There was nothing else going on. This is not a gossip show, but he really enjoyed her company. He was very fond of her. When Nathaniel Green, who became the hero of the war in the South at the end of the war, when he died, the South Carolinians had given him a plantation to honor him for what he had done. And Katie Green went to live on this plantation. And it was there that the man who claimed credit for inventing the cotton gin went to visit, and actually it was Katie Green who had come up, by then Catherine Green, who had come up with the design for the cotton gin. If you're African American, this is one of the low points in American history, because of course it continued slavery. But if you're interested in inventions, one should credit Catherine Green with inventing the cotton gin. So these women came for patriotic reasons, whereas the ordinary camp follower came out of necessity. What they shared in common was they often were extremely lonely when their husbands or fathers or brothers were away. The British Army had a very different policy. You could bring your wife along on the ships that came over to America, and many of the men did bring their wives with them or their sweethearts with them. And these women were listed as the boat was loaded. They kept ship was loaded. They kept an inventory of what came on the ship, who the sailors were, who the fighting men were, who were being transported, what supplies they had brought on the ship, and the women were listed under the category of the baggage of the ship. And that's why in many parts of this country, a woman who had a bad reputation in town was referred to as a piece of baggage. It comes from this transport inventory that the British kept. Among the women who often traveled with their husbands on the part of the British Army were the wives of Hessians. The Hessians were contract soldiers. That is, these were men who earned their livelihood by signing on to fight for a king or a prince or a government that needed soldiers. And Hesse produced a good number of these contract soldiers. Among them was the Baron de Riedesel, who brought his men over to America to fight with the British. And with the Baron came the Baroness, Frederica von de Riedesel. And she was at Saratoga when Burgoyne was defeated. That is the great turning point in the American Revolution, when the British Army was defeated at Saratoga. General Burgoyne, whose nickname was Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, and it was not, as some people thought, because he was a dandy. It was because he did not whip his soldiers as much as regular generals did in the British Army. That is, they weren't flogged for infractions as often, and so the men referred to him as Gentleman Johnny. Well, traveling with them were the Hessian troops of de Riedesel, and so the Baroness was captured along with her husband. And all these Hessian troops were brought to Boston at first to make sure they didn't fight again. Boston, when winter came, said, no, it's too expensive for us to provide supplies and firewood to these enemies. You've got to take them somewhere else. And so they were sent to Virginia, and therein hangs a tale. The Baroness had traveled with her husband everywhere, and she produced a lot of children. All of them were girls. All of them were daughters. And everywhere she went that she had a child, she named the child after the place. And so she had a daughter named Canada. And when she got to Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, who, despite his reputation as a Democrat, was actually very entranced with people who had royal titles. And so he immediately invited the Baron and the Baroness de Riedesel to his house for dinner, and they became good friends. And when the Baroness produced a child in America, it was a girl, which she named Virginia. Thomas Jefferson, who, among many of his characteristics that women's historians don't find to be positive, was not a feminist. And he sent the Baron a condolence note when he found out that this child, she was named America, not Virginia, I apologize. When he found out that the Baroness had had yet another daughter instead of a son, she kept a very elaborate diary of her travels with her husband, and it's filled with, I think, very vivid accounts of what it was like with Burgoyne's army that had marched down from Canada and ran out of food and ran out of supplies and suffered enormously. A lot of these women who were traveling with the army were virtually starving, as were many of Burgoyne's soldiers. And in fact, when he surrendered, the American general invited him to a rather sumptuous dinner because, of course, they were both gentlemen, and gentlemen treated one another that way. Meanwhile, the army was still starving. And so her accounts of this are really very dramatic and really very detailed, and would make a wonderful, an excerpt from one of them would make a wonderful piece to use in a classroom to see what being in the army in the 18th century was really like for the ordinary soldier, because she was very sensitive to the way the Hessians, who were ordinary soldiers who were traveling with her husband, were treated. So I think you have to think about the American Revolution realistically as a war that involved men and women. It's not difficult to imagine that, I think, because it was an 8-year home front war. And that meant that civilians as well as official soldiers were involved everywhere the war went. And so next time you think about Valley Forge, I hope you'll think about it as a place where women and children as well as soldiers spent a very difficult winter.